cowboy burst through the church doors carrying documents no one had seen before, just as a woman was about to lose the only home her father left behind. Snow swirled across the church floor as the heavy doors slammed against the wall. A ring of ranch keys clinked onto the table in front of Pearl Whitaker. The clerk lifted his pen. No one spoke. Then a gust of cold air rushed in, and every head in the room turned toward the man standing in the doorway, holding a weather-worn document case. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and join us for more unforgettable frontier stories. The last church supper of the season always brought the people of Ruby Ridge together. Families arrived in wagons. Children ran across the yard, chasing one another through the cold autumn air. The smell of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and apple preserves drifted from the church hall and out into the fading light. Inside, Pearl Whitaker stood beside a long wooden table, carefully setting silverware beside chipped white plates. Her hands looked steady. They were not. That morning, a folded notice had arrived from town. The paper now sat hidden inside her apron pocket. 6 weeks. That was all the time she had left. 6 weeks to settle a debt she had never known existed. 6 weeks before Silas Grady could claim the small horse ranch her father had spent 20 years building beneath the pine-covered slopes above Bitter Pine River. Pearl adjusted another fork, then another. Anything to keep her mind from returning to the number written across the bottom of the notice. Families filled the room. Neighbors greeted neighbors. Laughter echoed from table to table. Yet when supper began and people started choosing their seats, an odd space formed around Pearl. No one said anything cruel. No one needed to. The empty chairs said enough. She took a seat near the far end of the table and folded her hands in her lap. The chair beside her remained empty. So did the next one. Across the room, conversations continued. A few glances drifted her way before quickly moving elsewhere. Pearl lowered her eyes. She had grown used to silence. What hurt was how quickly people stepped away when trouble arrived. The church door opened. Cold air swept through the hall. A tall cowboy stepped inside. Dust still clung to his boots. His tan coat carried the marks of long travel. He removed his hat and glanced around the crowded room. Then his gaze settled on the empty seats beside Pearl. Without hesitation, he crossed the hall. Conversations softened. Several heads turned. The stranger stopped beside her table. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Mind saving me a seat at your table?" For a moment, Pearl simply stared at him. His eyes were calm, friendly, as though sitting beside her was the most natural thing in the world. "No," she said quietly. "I don't mind." He pulled out the chair and sat down. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, conversations resumed. "My name's Clay Bennett," he said. "Pearl Whitaker." "Nice to meet you, Miss Whitaker." The supper began. At first they spoke only a little, but Clay had a way of telling stories that felt easy. He described wild horses in the Idaho mountains, a mule that had once stolen an entire sack of apples, a snowstorm that trapped 3 cowboys inside a trading post for 4 days. Pearl tried not to smile. She failed. The laugh escaped before she could stop it. The sound surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. "There it is," Clay said. "What?" "That smile." Pearl looked away, embarrassed. Outside, darkness settled over Ruby Ridge. Inside, the lamps cast warm circles of light across the tables. For the first time in many months, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. When supper finally ended, people began gathering coats and saying goodnight. Clay walked beside her toward the church entrance. "I was wondering something," he said. Pearl looked up. "Can I stop by your ranch tomorrow?" Before she could answer, a feeling made her glance across the room. A man stood near the back wall. Silas Grady. One hand rested on a black leather folder. the same folder that held the papers threatening her future. His cold eyes moved from Pearl to Clay, then back again. The smile slowly disappeared from Pearl's face, and for the first time that evening, she remembered exactly how little time she had left. Silas Grady remained where he stood near the back wall of the church hall. The leather folder never left his hand. Neither did his stare. Clay followed her gaze. "Friend of yours?" he asked quietly. Pearl almost laughed at the idea. "No." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Just a man with paperwork." Clay glanced across the room. Silas turned and walked away before either of them could say another word. Outside, the October air had sharpened. The mountains beyond Ruby Ridge stood dark against a sky crowded with stars. Pearl started toward her wagon. Clay walked beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. The sound of boots on packed dirt and distant horses shifting in their hitching lines filled the silence. Finally, Clay cleared his throat. "So, can I stop by tomorrow?" Pearl looked ahead toward the road leading home. Most people asked questions. Most people offered advice. Most people disappeared when they learned there was trouble. Yet this man was asking if he could come back. "If you want to." His smile returned. "I do." The next morning arrived cold and bright. Pearl was already outside before sunrise. The ranch sat at the base of the eastern ridge where pine trees climbed toward the mountains. Frost covered the fence rails. A thin layer of ice floated across the horse trough. She carried a bucket toward the barn when she heard hoofbeats. At first, she thought she imagined them. Then a chestnut gelding appeared through the gate. Clay Bennett sat in the saddle. Right on time. He tipped his hat. "Morning." Pearl stopped walking. "You actually came." Clay looked amused. Was there some doubt? She set down the bucket. "A little." His grin widened. "Fair enough." Within half an hour he was repairing the broken front gate. No speeches, no flirting, just work. He removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and set new hinges into place while Eddie Whitaker hauled tools from the shed. Eddie was 16 and suspicious of almost everyone, especially strangers. Yet by midday he was handing Clay nails and asking questions about horses. "You really rode all the way from Idaho?" Eddie asked. "Further than that. See any grizzlies?" "2." Eddie's eyes widened. Pearl watched from the porch while cleaning harness straps. The scene felt strangely ordinary, as though Clay had been there before, as though he belonged. The thought unsettled her. Around noon they shared coffee from enamel cups near the barn. Clay sat on an overturned feed bucket. Pearl remained on the fence rail. The horses shifted quietly behind them. A red mare stretched her neck toward Clay. He scratched her forehead without interrupting the conversation. "She likes you," Pearl said. "She likes the apple in my pocket." Pearl looked at him. "There's an apple in your pocket?" Clay produced it with a guilty expression. The mare immediately tried to steal it. For the second time in 2 days, Pearl laughed. The sound lingered in the cool air. Later that afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the mountains. The first storm of the season was coming. Everyone in Ruby Ridge could feel it. Clay spent the next several hours helping Eddie move hay bales into the storage shed before the weather arrived. By sunset, the yard looked different. Tidier, stronger, ready. Before leaving, Clay paused beside the porch steps. "I'll come by tomorrow." Pearl folded her arms. "You already decided that?" "Seems efficient." She shook her head. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when necessary." The next day he returned, and the day after that. Soon a rhythm developed. Clay repaired a leaking section of fence, helped reinforce the stable doors, cleaned out a clogged water channel that had been causing problems for months. He never acted as though Pearl owed him anything, never pushed for answers, never asked about the debt. 1 week passed, then another. People in town started noticing. At Dawson's Mercantile, conversations quieted whenever Pearl entered. At the post office, heads turned. At the diner beside the train stop, she overheard whispers. Most ignored them. One afternoon, while purchasing lamp oil, she heard something she couldn't ignore. 2 ranch hands stood near the counter. Colorado's still waiting for him. That management job? Best position around, house included. Pearl slowed. Thought he'd taken it. So did I. Man would be crazy not to. The words stayed with her all the way home. That evening she found Clay sitting on the hillside above the ranch. The sun was sinking behind the mountains. Orange light stretched across the valley below. Clay was studying something in his hands. A folded map. He didn't notice her at first. His attention remained fixed on markings faded from years of use. Pearl stopped several yards away. The wind moved through the grass between them. After a moment, Clay looked up. For the first time since they'd met, something flickered across his face. Not surprise, not guilt. Something closer to hesitation. Pearl's eyes dropped to the map, then back to him. The valley below glowed gold beneath the setting sun. And suddenly, she realized there were still things about Clay Bennett she did not know. Important things. Things he had chosen not to tell her. The map remained in his hands as the last light faded from the mountains. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The wind moved across the hillside, bending the tall grass in slow waves below the darkening sky. Clay folded the map carefully. Not quickly. Not like a man caught doing something wrong. Just a man deciding whether to explain. "You travel with that everywhere?" Pearl asked. "Most places." "What is it?" He looked down at the worn paper, a reminder. The answer explained almost nothing, yet something in his voice kept her from pressing further. Below them, the lamps of Ruby Ridge began to appear one by one. Small squares of yellow light scattered through the valley. Clay stood and tucked the map inside his coat. "Storm's coming." Pearl glanced toward the western ridge. Heavy clouds were already swallowing the last of the sunset. "You sound certain. I've seen enough winters to know when the mountains are warning people." The storm arrived 2 days later. It came fast. The first snow began before dawn. By breakfast, visibility had dropped to less than 100 yards. By noon, drifts were piling against barns and fence posts. The Bitter Pine River disappeared beneath blowing white sheets of snow. Everyone in Ruby Ridge stopped what they were doing and prepared for winter. At the Whitaker Ranch, Clay worked beside Eddie from sunrise until dark. They secured stable doors, moved feed sacks into dry storage, checked every horse twice. Pearl spent most of the day carrying lanterns, blankets, and hot coffee between buildings. At dusk, the 3 of them finally gathered inside the barn office. A small stove crackled in the corner. Snow tapped softly against the window. For a little while, it felt safe. Then the knock came. 3 hard strikes against the door. Everyone looked up. Clay opened it. Silas Grady stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. The warmth in the room vanished instantly. "I won't stay long," Silas said. His eyes settled on Pearl. "I only came because certain matters can't wait." Pearl already knew she wasn't going to like what came next. Silas removed several folded documents from his leather folder. "The debt isn't what you think it is." Pearl stood. "What does that mean?" "It means your father signed an additional agreement." He unfolded the paper. There was a second obligation attached to the original note. Eddie moved closer to his sister. Pearl stared at the document. The signature looked like her father's. The amount written beneath it made her stomach drop. It was nearly double. That isn't possible. Unfortunately, it is. Silas's voice remained calm. Too calm. With penalties included, the entire balance becomes due immediately. Snow rattled against the roof. Nobody spoke. "You're lying," Eddie finally said. Silas looked at him almost sadly. "I wish I were." Then he handed the papers to Pearl. "You should read them carefully." The door closed behind him moments later. The storm swallowed the sound of his departing horse. Pearl remained standing. The papers felt heavier than they should have. Clay read them after she did. His expression didn't change. That worried her more than if it had. "Well?" she asked. He looked at the signature, then at the date, then back at the signature again. "I don't know." It was the first uncertain answer she had heard from him. The following days were worse. News spread through Ruby Ridge. It always did. People began whispering in stores, at church, outside the post office. Some believed Silas, others weren't sure. Most simply avoided taking sides. The isolation Pearl had felt before returned. Only now it was heavier. One evening she found herself standing alone inside the main stable. Snow blew through the gaps between the boards. The horses shifted quietly in their stalls. The debt notice rested on a workbench beside her. So did a pen. The offer Silas had left was simple. Sell the ranch, walk away, end the fight. Pearl picked up the pen. Her fingers tightened around it. Maybe her father really had signed the papers. Maybe the ranch was already lost. Maybe she was only delaying the inevitable. The stable door opened. Cold air swept inside. Clay stepped through. Neither of them spoke. He saw the paper, saw the pen, understood immediately. Pearl lowered her eyes. "I can't keep doing this." The words barely rose above the wind. Clay walked to the workbench. For a moment he simply stood beside her. Then he placed his hand gently over the document. Not taking it away, not forcing anything, just stopping the next step. "Not yet." Pearl looked at him. The lantern light flickered between them. Outside, the storm howled across Ruby Ridge. Inside, everything felt strangely still. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to lean against someone else's strength. Only slightly. Only for a moment. Clay didn't move away. His hand remained over hers. Warm. Steady. Neither of them noticed how long they stood there. The silence said enough. But before dawn came, before the storm had fully passed, before either of them could imagine what was waiting beyond the next morning, Clay Bennett disappeared. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. Only fresh snow stretching across the ranch yard and a set of hoof prints leading away from Ruby Ridge. By sunrise, they were already vanishing beneath the wind. Pearl stood on the porch with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. The mountains looked colder than she had ever seen them. For a long time she stared toward the road Clay had taken. No rider appeared. No explanation came. Nothing. Eddie searched the barn, the stable, the bunkhouse, even the creek trail behind the cottonwoods. By noon, he returned with snow on his boots and frustration written across his face. "He's gone." Pearl nodded. She already knew. The days that followed moved slowly, painfully. The storm finally passed, but the silence it left behind seemed worse. Every morning Pearl found herself glancing toward the gate. Every afternoon she caught herself listening for hoofbeats. Every evening she felt foolish for doing it. Clay never came. The map, the Colorado job, the strange look on his face that evening on the hill. Now it all seemed clear. He had simply left, like so many others before him. The hearing was scheduled 3 days later, at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, inside the same church where they had first met, the same church where he had asked for a seat at her table. Ruby Ridge woke early that day. Wagons lined the street. Men stood outside the mercantile discussing the case. Women whispered near the post office. Everyone knew what was about to happen. By 9:30, the church hall was already crowded. Pearl arrived with Eddie. The room quieted as she entered. Not completely, just enough to notice. Silas Grady sat near the front. A lawyer from Helena occupied the chair beside him. Several folders rested neatly on the table. The debt papers, the alleged contract, witness statements. Everything looked organized, prepared, permanent. Pearl took a seat near the back, the same place she had occupied so many times lately. Alone. The hearing began. One document after another was presented. Dates, amounts, signatures, old records. The lawyer spoke calmly, confidently. Each page seemed to push the ranch farther away. Several townspeople testified that Pearl's father had spoken of debts before his death. Others admitted they knew little. No one could challenge the documents directly. The room gradually shifted. Pearl could feel it happening. People who had once nodded kindly now avoided her eyes, not because they disliked her, because they believed she had already lost. Near noon, the clerk reviewed the final paperwork. The transfer order sat ready. Only signatures remained. Eddie leaned forward beside her. "This isn't right." Pearl placed a hand on his arm. For once, she had no answer. No fight left. No miracle coming. Only facts. Or at least what appeared to be facts. The clerk dipped his pen into the ink bottle. Silas adjusted his vest. The lawyer smiled faintly, and something inside Pearl finally settled. Not hope, not peace, acceptance. She stood slowly. Every head turned. The room became very quiet. From her coat pocket, she removed the ring of ranch keys, the stable key, the feed storage key, the workshop key her father had carried for years. Pearl walked forward, then placed them gently on the table. The small sound of metal against wood seemed louder than it should have been. No tears came, no speeches, no begging, just dignity. The room remained silent. Even Silas appeared surprised. Pearl stepped back. The clerk reached for the transfer papers. Then the church doors burst open. Cold air rushed inside. Snowflakes swirled across the floorboards. Every head turned at once. A man stood in the doorway, dust-covered, travel-worn, breathing hard. Clay Bennett. For a moment nobody moved. Behind him stood an elderly man carrying a leather satchel, and behind them came a third man holding a long wooden document case. Clay's eyes found Pearl immediately. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, as though he had been racing against time and had arrived with only seconds to spare. "Sorry I'm late," he said. Then he walked straight toward the front of the church. The room exploded into whispers, and Silas Grady suddenly looked far less comfortable than he had a moment earlier. Snow melted from Clay Bennett's coat onto the church floor as he crossed the room. The elderly man beside him carried himself carefully, one hand resting on a worn leather satchel that looked older than most of the buildings in Ruby Ridge. The third man placed the wooden document case on the front table. Nobody spoke. Even the clerk had stopped moving. Pearl remained where she stood. For a moment she forgot to breathe. 3 days. 3 days of wondering. 3 days of believing he had ridden away. Clay finally looked at her. There was apology in his eyes, and something else. Determination. "Before any transfer is signed," he said, turning toward the clerk, There are records this town needs to see. Silas rose from his chair. This hearing is already underway. So it is. Clay's voice remained calm. Which is why the truth should be part of it. The elderly man stepped forward. My name is Walter Finch. Several older residents immediately recognized the name. A murmur spread through the room. Years earlier, Finch had served as a county records notary before retiring to a settlement near Helena. The old man opened his satchel. Inside were copies of land filings, payment receipts, and registry documents, carefully preserved, carefully dated. One by one they were placed on the table. The room grew quieter with every page. The original ranch agreement was there. So were payment records made by Pearl's father. Then came something nobody expected. A second document, older than the one Silas had presented, bearing the same reference number, but entirely different terms. The clerk adjusted his spectacles and read silently. His expression changed. The lawyer beside Silas leaned forward, then read it again. Silas's confidence began slipping away. "What is this?" someone asked. Walter Finch answered. "The original filing." He tapped the paper gently. "The version recorded with the county." The church fell silent. The lawyer took the document, compared signatures, compared dates, compared seals. Several long minutes passed. Nobody moved. Finally, the lawyer lowered the papers. "The amendment Mr. Grady submitted contains alterations." Silas immediately stood. "That's absurd." But his voice lacked conviction. The lawyer ignored him. The amounts were changed. The clerk looked up. "The debt claimed against the Whitaker property is not supported by the original filing." A ripple moved through the crowd, like wind crossing tall grass. Pearl gripped the back of a chair. She wasn't sure her legs could support her. The clerk reviewed the records once more. Then he placed Silas's documents aside. "Ownership of the Whitaker Ranch remains with Miss Whitaker." The room erupted. Some gasped. Others began talking all at once. Silas sank back into his chair. For the first time since Pearl had known him, he had nothing to say. Eddie let out a laugh that sounded suspiciously close to a sob. Pearl closed her eyes, only for a second, just long enough to feel the weight lift. When she opened them again, Clay was still watching her. Hours later, the church had emptied. Snow reflected moonlight outside. The town had finally settled. Pearl found Clay standing alone near the hitching rail. His horse waited nearby. The same chestnut gelding, the same saddle. Yet somehow everything felt different now. "You could have told me," she said softly. Clay nodded. "I know." She looked at him. "Where did you go, Colorado?" The answer surprised her. He reached into his coat and removed the folded map she had seen weeks earlier. "I went to turn something down." Pearl waited. The ranch position. The cold wind moved through the street. Clay stared toward the dark mountains. "I spent years saving money." His voice remained steady. "Every cattle drive, every horse contract, every winter job." He smiled faintly. "I thought owning land was the thing I wanted most." Pearl listened. The records weren't easy to find. The witnesses weren't easy to reach. He paused. "Most of my savings paid for the search." Pearl stared at him. The realization arrived slowly. Then all at once. "You gave it up." Clay looked back at her. "No." His smile softened. "I gave up one dream." Silence settled between them. Comfortable. Warm despite the cold. Spring arrived slowly in Ruby Ridge. Snow retreated from the hillsides. Grass returned. The bitter pine river swelled with mountain runoff. Life moved forward, and so did they. 1 year later, the church hall filled again for the annual supper. The same tables, the same lamps, the same familiar room. Pearl sat in her old seat near the end of the table. Only this time, the chairs around her weren't empty. Neighbors greeted her. Children ran through the hall. Laughter drifted from every corner. The church door opened. A familiar cowboy stepped inside. Clay crossed the room, pulled out the chair beside her, and sat down. His eyes met hers. That familiar smile appeared. "Still saving me a seat?" Pearl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket. A small ring rested in her palm. Simple, honest, like everything that mattered. She placed it gently on the table between them. Clay looked down, then back at her. Neither of them needed another speech. The answer was already there. Around them, the supper continued. Plates clattered, coffee poured, people laughed. But for a moment, it felt as though the entire world had narrowed to one table. One promise. One seat that had never truly been empty. And one place where both of them had finally found what they had been searching for all along. Home. When I think about Pearl and Clay, I don't really think about the ranch, the debt papers, or even the courtroom victory. I think about that empty chair. Because sometimes the biggest moments in our lives don't begin with a grand speech or a dramatic rescue. Sometimes they begin with someone quietly choosing to sit beside us when everyone else walks away. Imagine yourself in Pearl's place. Imagine carrying a burden nobody seems willing to share. Imagine believing you've been left behind, only to discover that someone saw your struggle and stayed anyway. Not because it was easy, not because it benefited them, but because your future mattered to them. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. We spend so much of life searching for certainty, yet healing often arrives in much smaller ways. A hand resting over a document before a mistake is made. A promise kept without being spoken. A person who returns when every reason says they should keep writing. Real love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a choice made over and over again, especially when nobody is watching. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. What moment touched you the most? And if you'd like to spend more evenings listening to stories about courage, second chances, quiet devotion, and the unexpected places people find belonging, you're always welcome to join us again. There are many more journeys waiting just beyond the next trail.